When using the ladder leader, 6-inch pre-tied droppers can be made in advance. These droppers are attached using hitch knots and are kept in place by figure 8 knots in the ladder leader itself. A pre-made ladder leader with figure 8 knots regularly spaced between 6 and say 10 inches allows continuous variation of the spacing of the nymphs without the need to retie. The end of the ladder leader is actually formed using a pre-tied 6-inch dropper. This is attached using the same hitch knot as the regular droppers, this time to a final figure 8 stopper knot at the end of the ladder leader. The ability to quickly change spacing and depth of nymphs without the need for a complete re-rig means most anglers are much more likely to make these changes and therefore pick up extra fish.
Welcome to this deep dive spotlight on the ladder leader. Now, obviously there's quite a lot of detail in the nymphing book about this set of techniques, but there's a really limited scope in the written and the illustrated format compared to the detail you can get into quite easily within the video. So that's what this is for. And as well as the basic bread and butter, the nuts and bolts of the rigging and the technique, what I wanted to start to do a little bit as well is to try and kickstart some of your own experimentations and getting into the sort of the intricacies, being a bit more inventive with it and creative with it as well. And the best place probably I think to start with is probably the original iteration of the ladder leader. And I've actually got John Pearson's very first example of a ladder leader. There is a terminal stopper knot right at the end of the tip of this leader, and this is made out of 7-pound fluorocarbon, and then there are pre-knotted ladder stops spaced about 6 inches apart. And obviously you can choose yourself in advance what your preferred spacing is depending on what the desired results or the desired flexibility that you're needing to get in your rig. And then this is about 4.5 feet to 5 feet long. And then at the far end is a permanent loop, and that's tied with a perfection loop. And that's for obviously attaching to, typically in our case, to the tip of our French leader. And this is designed specifically for short line nymphing in the Czech and the Polish style. And because of that, you're generally fishing in the sorts of conditions where it's a bit rugged, a bit rough and tumble. And having that durable leader material and tippet material is really, really helpful. And because of that, you can afford to go with that sort of 7-pound fluorocarbon. A little bit later on, we'll look at something that's a bit more subtle for some of that kind of summertime finesse, light tippet fishing, and we'll get onto that shortly. But as I say, for the short line nymphing, this fluorocarbon with the pre-tied ladder stops is where it's at really. And before I actually get on to rigging this up with some flies, it's really important. I noticed from some of the comments on the blog topic about the ladder leader, people are getting a bit confused about, oh, well, I can change the depth of things quite easily without this kind of having these multiple stops. And that's true, but what this is about is particularly for nymphing through the colder months where it's not only the depth itself, but it's the spacing between your team of flies. So you're using up to 3 flies, and sometimes the relationship of each fly to its other teammates is what the important thing is. So for instance, if you're catching fish in the lower third of the water column and 2 out of 3 of your flies are actually in the middle and upper layers, to be able to double down and actually concentrate those flies towards the riverbed, that's where you start to see some real benefits from the flexibility, because as has been proven time and time again, Sometimes that's a great thing to do when fish are feeding near the riverbed, and sometimes it actually scares the hell out of them. So, you can actually go from catching one or two to actually catching nothing at all if you get the spacing wrong. Now, if you've got, a pre-tied set dropper position, you've got really no capability of actually experimenting quickly with those different spacings, where you can have 2 or 3 casts with a particular setup and then change it and compare the results, because you're having to retie your rig every single time. And in those situations, best will in the world, you're just not going to do it. And even if you do it, you're wasting so much of your fishing time just by tweaking bits and elements of your rig. Whereas this, you can do it super quickly. And as I say, I wanted to instill that kind of experimental mindset as well, because as well as the the regular basic setup where your point fly is actually attached to a dropper that snags against the terminal stopper knot, you can, if you like, actually pre-rig, a whole ladder leader for short line nymphing with something like, one of these 2 gram sort of drop shot weights. Specifically because sometimes you really don't want a hook point to be the thing that's bumping along the riverbed, depending on how snaggy your river happens to be. And again, this is a great example of that kind of cross-pollination between, one style of fishing. Traditionally, fly fishers don't often speak a lot to some of the coarse, the bait anglers and, lure anglers or whatever it is. These tribes, we stay in our silos quite a lot. And, myself and John, we've discovered so many times over that there's so much benefit to pollinating your ideas across the different genres. It's just a fantastic thing to be able to do. So what I'll do, as I promised earlier on, we're going to get into the bread and butter, the basics of actually rigging up. This is something that can be pre-rigged ahead of time, so it's ready to go, in a pocket or in a sleeve that's stored inside your kit bag, but it can be pre-done and just picked up and ready to use on stream. You can even leave it attached to the end of your line if you know that that's what's the style that you're going to be fishing in that day. What I will do when I get onto the finesse rig up, I will show you how to create each one of those stops. But for the time being, let's assume and let's just go along with the fact that you can pre-rig this at home, so the preparation's done before you ever get on stream. So in terms of actually attaching flies to this rig, we've found obviously you can leave them pre-tied, pre-prepared droppers that are just hooked into a fairly large fly box, but that gets quite untidy quite quickly. And we found that some of these coarse angling rig storage boxes, such as this one happens to be made by Preston Innovations. It's got these kind of magnetic removable elements that you can, again, you can switch those out. You can pre-plan, if you like, the different options that you'd like on a particular day's fishing. And that's really helpful. One of the things you will notice, and again, if you've read that section of the book, you will notice that we included these shearing elastic. And the reason for that, these rig holders are designed for 6-inch hook lengths in bait fishing. Now, that's all very well when you know the size of the hook that you're going to attach, because you can tie the exact, correct hook length with a loop attachment on the end of it and your hook already on, and just give yourself, only just enough elasticity to hook the point and the bend of the hook over this end of the rig holder. In fly fishing, we like to have quite a variety of different flies, and anything from these super long shank kind of Vladdy's worm sort of style things through to little size 20 nymphs and everything in between. So that's really the reason for this elasticated section on the end of the rig holders. It just helps take out that variation for the shank length of each of the different patterns that you might use. It just helps to standardize it and make it a lot easier. Key details on this are the fact that there is a stopper knot on the end of each piece of elastic, and that's what we use to kind of hold the rigs in place. But what we are not doing is actually girth hitching the loops over that sort of the leg or the stem of those elasticated stoppers. And this design may evolve. By the time you're watching this, we might be on to kind of version 20 of this, where it might be a little bit different. But this certainly works really well, and it's worth understanding the principle because it's what everything else will flow from. But what I'm relying on here is the fact that when there is tension on this dropper leg here, it draws both of the legs, the arms, if you like, of the loop together, and that is sufficient to actually snug that loop in place around that stopper knot. So you don't need to be girth hitching onto the actual elasticated holders on these rig holders. You'll notice that there's the two little bunny ears just on the terminal point of each loop. That becomes important when you want to adjust the flies when they're actually in use, and we'll get onto that in a second. But the key thing, I guess, for this element is that just remember that the sequence is that you unhook the fly from the end of the rig first before trying to detach it from that. You sort of run the risk of maybe twanging that off like an elastic band if you're not careful, and it's just so much easier to do it that way around. So just unhitching that nymph and then allowing the tension to come off, that gives you, a very easy method of just popping the loop off there. And that's ready to obviously go back in your box and be used, at the next opportunity. So here's your pre-rigged short dropper. I like super short droppers for the sensitivity, the bite indication that they afford. So I'm working towards around about a 4-inch length for my droppers, which is ideal for me. And in fact, when I'm tying fixed length droppers, I try and keep them as short as this if I can, but often I need to allow a little bit more so that when I'm biting flies off and retying them to experiment with different patterns, I lose some of the length of that dropper. With this system, you can, if you like, you can have multiple examples of the same fly attached to perfect droppers that are the exact length that you want them, and actually switch out the whole dropper each time if you wanted to. And that's a great thing because, again, with the droppers, that if you make too many fly changes and you end up with a dropper leg that's too short, ultimately that means you either have to do without that fly or you have to re-rig the entire leader, which is, pain in the ass basically. So this is my preferred length. Again, it's kind of slightly serendipitous because that 4-inch length fits perfectly on a 6-inch rig stick in these Preston Innovations boxes. So there's a little bit of happy accident there, and it just happens to work really, really well. But what you'll end up with is the figure 8 loop. We use a figure 8 in preference to Vladdy's original swiveling droppers that he used. They tended to be done with perfection loops. We find there's a bit of an increase in durability and strength by using the figure 8 knot to create that loop, and we'll get into that as well. And then you've got the loop itself and then the bunny ear tags that are added on the end of that. And in use, it's hopefully, a really straightforward thing. It's actually even easier when you're out on stream because you'll have a bit of tension between your rod tip and the sort of the tippet that you're kind of handling. There's no need to go and sort of slip the fly or the loop over the end. You don't have to kind of thread the loop over the end of it like one of those kind of, buzzer, electric games where you've got to try and get the wire hoop along the, the twisty sort of assault course. So you can just select wherever it is that you want to attach that fly. You bend over the leader to make a sort of a blind-ended loop like that. You get yourself your dropper loop, and then you pass the dropper loop over the main stem of the leader. And then from whichever side you did it on, so if this one is slipped over this way, you push the fly up through that loop, jump it over the little snags, and then you just draw that whole system tight. You're as well to wet it, and then putting a bit of tension on between your forefinger and thumb and the rest of your fingers, just snug that down into position. And that just jumps that girth hitch into a perfect formation that is under enough tension to hold up when it comes up against the stopper, the ladder stop. But at the same time, it still allows that freedom movement and it'll spin. You can slide it easily as well. So I just slide that down to the next stop in the position that I want. And that is a nice, robust connection point. And it's very, very easy to alter that. And at the same time, you do have this swiveling effect so that, it's kind of a little bit less tangle prone. And with the loop having the 2 legs closest to the main stem, you actually get a bit of like a boom arm effect that holds that dropper out away from the stem of the leader. And whilst it doesn't eliminate tangles, it can certainly put you in the best position to actually avoid tangles where possible. So you spend a little bit less of your fishing day actually kind of unfurling, bits where it's formed little half hitches around the main stem of the leader, which is, super valuable because you might as well be fishing rather than, messing around with the gear. To adjust this, if you wanted to move this, to the next stop down along the leader, it's possible, perfectly possible to do it by taking the hook point, getting in there, particularly, if you've got like a, magnifier, getting the hook point into part of that girth hitch and just loosening it. But that is a little bit hit and miss, and it relies on you having pretty decent magnifiers or, very, very good opportunity to, to get right in there and see closely what you're doing. With the bunny ears, the rabbit ear tags on this, it's a lot easier to locate one of those and just jerk it loose like that. And then that allows you to jump that whole connection over that stop, slide it down to the next one and just snug it up just as we did for the previous one. So they're really easy to move around, snug up and change that spacing. You could see how you could easily do that and experiment with those spacings, which gives you that great flexibility to really hone in on what is working best on the day on your stream. And just to reiterate, with this thicker ladder leader stem material, ideally you're not actually tying your point fly to the end of that leader. What you're doing, in this example here, if I jump over the last but one ladder leader stop, when I tighten this up, what will happen is, if I just get it over the little bunny ear tags there, what will happen is that the terminal stopper knot there is what actually allows your point fly to snug up to that and then to be attached really securely. And it's a great, again, it provides really complete flexibility of this whole system. And so that's a really good overall introduction to the mechanics of and some of the experimentation that you can get into with the standard first version of the shortline nymphing ladder leader. Now that we've run through the basics of the shortline iteration of the ladder leader, I wanted to get into some of the more flexible applications, and this is where you can really start experimenting for yourself. But to round that off and to sort of segue neatly into that section, I wanted to just show you how to reattach any dropper that you'd sort of experimented with and that you've finished with, you want to put it back in your rig box so that you can switch out and select another pattern from your collection. Obviously, you've already seen how to unhitch it, and the sequence there is important. Similarly, you can actually make your life really hard by getting this in the wrong order. So my recommendation is that you do it in this sequence, okay? But feel free to experiment, but this is the best way that I've found. So you need to start with the dropper loop slightly open, ready to accept the elasticated stopper. Then what you need to do, pick out the stopper that you want to attach it to, slide that over there, and then actually take hold of the dropper. And I'm aware that I'm sort of hiding that a little bit in my grip there. But basically the technique is to kind of put a bit of tension on that system and slide it close to that stopper knot with the two arms of that loop knot drawn together. I would recommend holding on to the single stem of the dropper because that allows the greatest potential for those two arms of the loop to actually draw together and squeeze tightly around that stopper knot. That then, because you've got this elastication, then that allows you to slip the point of the hook over the end of the rig stick, and that holds it in place. It's way, way more difficult to put the hook on and then try and somehow organise to get a stretched under tension retaining sort of elasticated stopper through that loop and then get that loop to sit together neatly like that. When you do it in the sequence that I've shown you, everything's under control and it's much easier. And particularly, you probably want to practice this because it's great because you can do so much preparation in the house before you go fishing. You want to get yourself familiar with the mechanics of this before you actually have to do it live and for real when you're actually fishing. Because obviously it's a little bit more complicated. There's wind, you can drop things if you're not careful, that kind of thing. So that's the sequence for reattaching it. So now we've done a complete cycle of everything from removing and selecting a pattern, attaching it to a ladder leader, snugging it up to the stop, and then also being able to adjust that, removing it and popping it back onto your rig stick. So that's the complete cycle from that point of view. We'll get into some of the knots a little bit later on as well, but hopefully that gives you a really nice rounded overview for that. And one of the scenarios that you might want to be switching your flies out between different patterns and different options is particularly with the trio setup. And again, there's a special case study in the book talking about exactly why, the progression of a hatch from the kind of early stages where the nymphs are more active near the riverbed, moving through to kind of just subsurface emergers, and the fact that both the insects and the fish change their behaviour quite quickly, and the fact that you can track that behaviour with the ladder leader on a trio rig is fantastic, very great advantage. When I advise when you're fishing in that style, rather than using the stiff multi-stop main stem that we select for the rough and tumble of the shortline nymphing near to the riverbed, I like a much more subtle and supple actually leader material and tippet material. This is what I make the droppers out of anyway, so this is what you're presenting to the fish even when you've got a very thick main stem. But I like the main stem itself to be equally supple for some of these slightly more finesse. Particularly when you're fishing in summer when these conditions really come to the fore, you're often fishing in lower water levels, so shallower water, brighter conditions, clearer water, so things that really highlight sort of anything that's not quite as subtle as it should be with your rig. You may well find material that performs equally well to this, but this particular brand and product line we found to be extremely effective in this application because it's very resistant to the wear and tear of kind of the knots themselves and then the movement and the sort of the potential friction that you can set up. So it's got very high knot strength. It's also very resistant to wind knots. It doesn't lose anything like the breaking strain or the proportion of the breaking strain that many other brands or product lines that you might find in tippet material. It's not uncommon to find a tippet material that is around about this diameter, in this case 0.11 millimeters. You can lose more than half the breaking strain quite easily by putting either a wind knot or, in our case, a figure of 8 knot in it. But this is particularly resistant to that, and that makes it ideal for these techniques. But what I want to show you is that rather than have a preset ladder of lots and lots of stops every few inches, with this method what I suggest you do, and we can pretend that this piece of tippet is essentially the length of tippet that's hanging from below the dry fly. So this is probably where your nymphs are going to go as an example. What I would suggest to you is that maybe if you've got a good idea where one position will be for your dropper fly, add a stop in there, before you start fishing, by all means. But after that, if you're going to be making adjustments, one of the best things you can do is actually only tie the stopper knot where you want it, when you want it. So don't bother having a stopper until you need it. And then you can just choose the exact location that you want it, drop a quick ladder stop in there with a figure of 8 knot, and then slide your dropper fly to that position. That way it maintains a lot of flexibility, but it also reduces the number of knots that you put in that main stem. And that has finesse benefits, it also has like robustness benefits as well. So in terms of the knot itself, I drew, in the book I draw this in a very specific way, and I did this for a reason. It not only allows you to place the knots very precisely, it's also a really quick and easy way to achieve that figure of 8 knot. And it revolves around having a kind of a finger and thumb grip on a stem of the leader, the tippet material, and then trap the free end of that with your pinky finger against the meat of your hand there. You can then go in with 2 fingers here and make a complete circuit around. Then what you want to do is don't grab from in front of your pinky finger, grab the tag end down here, because that lets you keep hold with that pinky finger, and when you pull the rest of that, the tail end of that through, that sets exactly where that knot's going to form. And when you release that from your finger, you can verify that it is a figure of 8 knot. You've not done an overhand knot, you've made it enough of a complete turn around and then back around the far side of it to create that figure of 8. If you've got an overhand knot, go back and do it again and make sure you get that full twist in before you pull the tail end through. Obviously, as with all knots, wet it and then just gently draw it tight. But using that little finger to anchor where that loop is, that lets you place the stopper exactly where you need it to be. And that's probably my top tip for that. It helps you be really precise with your placements, which after all is what we're trying to achieve with this presentation anyway. I'm just going to go through that one more time, but this time I'm going to ask a lot of John and we're going to get really, really close with a super tight camera angle. And between that tight camera angle and the diagrams in the book, I hope it'll really lock in the method of tying this knot for you. So I'm going to come away from the knot that I've already tied. So I've got the trapping point here, the finger and thumb, and then the pinky finger. Create just enough slack that you need with the 2 fingers. Come around once, and then all the way around again, and then grab underneath that pinky finger before pulling through. And you'll start, even drawing the tail end through starts to snug down the knot, but you can keep that finger in place as long as you need it, just to set the position of that knot. And then I would wet it, but just for the purposes of staying tight on it, I'll just pull out the finger from there. You can check that it's definitely a figure of 8 shape. And then obviously after wetting it, I'd go ahead then and draw it down to make your stop. And having got the stops, in the positions that you want, where you want to be able to move your droppers to, the only thing I've not really covered for the trio style is the attachment of your point fly. Now, with the fluorocarbon iteration of the ladder leader, with the short line nymphing tactics, we tend to use a stopper knot right at the end. So there's like a terminal stopper right near the tip of the tippet itself. With the trio, I very commonly simply tie the nymph itself, my point fly, directly to that main stem, because it's in the same diameter of material that I want to present my flies on anyway, and also because it would be pretty much unheard of for me to reuse a piece of tippet between different sessions of fishing anyway. So as long as you've got a little bit of flexibility, you've got plenty of fly changes on your point fly position compared to a dropper before it starts getting too short. And in reality, with a ladder leader, even if it did start to get too close to your other fly, you could just put another stop in and hitch it up. So that's one of the main differences, I would say, between the short line nymphing ladder leader with multiple stops and thicker fluorocarbon. This is like a nylon copolymer, and it's far finer, far more supple, and you have got more flexibility in terms of adding the point fly directly to that rig, rather than relying always on the ladder stops themselves.
Paul's asked me to jump in front of the camera just to give you a quick sort of rundown on the method of tying loops for attaching ladder leader droppers, and give you a little bit of the sort of background of where this came from. We first started using hitches over stopper knots when we fished with Masami Sakakibara in Japan, and he actually uses it for attaching to the end of Tenkara level line, which is like sort of something in the region of 10-pound breaking strain fluorocarbon, to things like 4-pound tippet material, around 5x. And making a long loop and hitching it over and butting it up to a stopper knot, I have to admit I was very sceptical, and I was very resistant to using that at the start. But having used it, it's proved to be probably the strongest method of attaching tippet and droppers and things of anything I've ever used. And it's interesting, I'd never really made the connection at the time we were learning from Masami, but in pole fishing in the UK, there's an identical method of attachment for the end of a rig, and I've tied up some bright orange here just for visibility. But this is a long figure 8 knot, a long figure 8 loop rather, with another figure 8 loop just tied in the end of it. And this is actually the attachment method for the end of competition course fishing poles. I've got a section of one of my poles here, so if I just give you a quick rundown. At the end of a pole, there's a section of elastic runs through a pole that gives you some shock absorption and fish playing ability. And at the end, there's a tiny little loop of Dacron with a knot in it. And the attachment method is identical to the attachment method of attaching the droppers on the ladder leader. We simply make a hitch in the line, put it over, pull that tight and butt it down to the stopper knot. I mean, it's bitten on so tight there it won't even slide. And that connection is just like the bunny ears and loop connection. If I were to snip this, we're now leaving bunny ears instead of a loop. It's purely academic whether there's a loop or bunny ears on this, because the hook is probably a couple of meters away. When you're fishing a short dropper that can loop back on itself easily, a loop there becomes a liability. So just leaving bunny ears as opposed to a loop just leaves us less prone to tangles. But the strength in this is absolutely phenomenal. This particular elastic in this pole is designed for landing double figure carp. So that attachment method is using something in the region of sort of 6 to 8 pound breaking strain lines to land fish up to 20 pounds on what's almost a fixed line method. There's no reel to give line out, only the stretching this elastic. So when it comes to using these loops with hitches, don't for 1 second think that there's any compromise in strength. It's probably the strongest dropper attachment method you're ever likely to use. All that being said, I'm here to actually demonstrate the use of one of these, so let's get straight to that. Again, I'm going to use this very bright coloured nylon just for visibility purposes. Obviously, I'm expecting that you'll be using something like 4 or 5x nylon for most droppers. The brilliant thing about using a loop tying tool is that you can get very consistent lengths and size of loop. So let's say we wanted a 6-inch dropper. What I'd do is I want to leave about this much tag end, which is, let's have a look, 4-5 inches maybe. Good long tag end, so that you've got some sort of loose material to work with tying your loop. So let's say I wanted a 6-inch dropper. I'd put my fly at the 6-inch mark on the ruler, and then what I would do is I would fold that line over. So when I pick that up, you've got a folded over piece of loop, and that apex of that is at 6 inches. The way we use this tool then, I'm going to use thumb and middle finger to hold the line like this. So we're holding the loop with the loop sticking out, and then I'm going to use my index and middle finger just to hold the apex of the loop. You don't need a huge amount of dexterity, so don't panic that this is like some kind of, you know, magician sort of dexterity skill level. All you need to do is be able to hold that there, and that is the only dexterity you're going to need, because the tool's going to do all the rest. So what we're going to do, I'll put this down on the table so Paul can get some focus. It's a very difficult sort of set of things to focus on. Can you see that, Paul?
Yeah, I'm in there.
So I'm going to put the tool on the line like that, so it's on the sort of chin of the tool, let's say, and I'm going to spin that 1 and a half turns like that. That's put nearly 2 turns on. When I come up with that, I'm going to go on from the top. That makes it 2 full turns. And what I'm doing is I'm putting the loop over the tool and into the slot. You see that, Paul?
Yeah, I got it.
So the loop's gone in there, and then I'm pulling tight like that. That's pretty much it. We're on the home straight now. All I'm going to do, you see this?
Yeah.
I'm going to keep pulling and slide down the tool and just pull. And that gives me a nice tool to pull with as well. You can actually grab the tool and use it to tighten up the knot. And this gives me a wonderfully consistent knot in terms of size and the quality of the tying. If I trim that tag end off, and when you've measured and folded, it's at the same place every single time. So you can do like clones lined up in your box. You can have absolutely perfect droppers with, you know, varying flies on the end, but the same kind of rig length every time. With the attachment method, we have the bunny ears on top, and when we do it this way, there's no bunny ears obviously sticking on the end of that. So the way that we achieve this is to tie basically however long you want to use to make it easy for you to tie. I'm choosing roughly 6 or 7 inches, and I'm going to thread this through so it's just on the line once like that, and then I'm going to tie a Pitson loop. Now there is a video from us available with Paul showing you how he ties a Pitson loop. It's Paul's primary attachment method for attaching the hook. It's my secondary attachment method. I've always favoured the Palomar because I learnt to tie that in my coarse fishing, specimen fishing days. But I will say I've tested both knots and there's really nothing to choose between them. The Pitson's a very, very strong knot. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tie a Pitson knot, but there's really no need for me to try and explain it because I'm not the best person to explain how to tie one.
There's some detailed drawings in the nymphing book on exactly how I do it as well. So.
Yeah, so I'm quickly going to rattle one off now, but I'd be embarrassed to try and teach it because it's not the one that I've got hundreds of hours of practice tying. But I can pull that tight and slip it down.
Just explain to people as well the best place to hold the dropper leg when you're doing that as well.
Yeah, whenever you're doing any tightening of loops, like when you're hitching it onto your ladder leader, or if you're tying tippet onto the end of a leader, if you're using a hitch or if you're tightening this knot up, it's always best to pull on the single line, not on the 2 parts of the loop. If you pull on the 2 parts of the loop, you can end up with things kicking off to one side and one leg's slightly longer or shorter than the other, and it does compromise the sort of the way it sits and the strength. So if I hold the single and I pull up, we can see that Pitson loop just tighten up there, and that leaves us 2 nice tag ends that we can just trim, and it's up to you what length you want them. But this is where you get that classic bunny ears from. You can see why we call it bunny ears when it's sticking up like this. And that just gives us our tag ends for pulling this loose when we want to get it off the ladder leader. And as I say, this method of attachment is just far superior to anything else I've ever used. Every instinct of my being was against it when I first saw this attachment method. But having tested it and tested it against other attachment methods, it's probably the strongest attachment method you're ever going to use. Don't doubt it for 1 second. There are people who are competition pole fishing, you know, week in and week out, catching literally hundreds and hundreds of pounds of fish in a session, and these can be double figure carp, fighting really hard, and they're using this as the primary attachment method. So really, for us fly fishers, who on your average trout fishing day, if you're catching fish over £5, it's a really phenomenal fish. And if you're catching a double figure trout, you know, that can be a fish of a lifetime for most people. And this, it's absolutely no challenge at all for that attachment method. It's super, super strong, so don't doubt it.